Hello, I'm Stacia Edmonston, and I'm a rehabilitation counselor, and I've worked in the field of brain injury rehabilitation and services for well over 30 years. And the topic that we're going to discuss now is addiction and brain injury. So for folks living with brain injury, they oftentimes come with a constellation of challenges. Some that are under the surface and that their treatment team or the folks who are supporting them may not be aware that is in play when they're trying to provide services to them. So I always want to stress when I talk to providers and family members that folks living with a brain injury, they could have a traumatic brain injury, that is that blow from an external force, such as a fall, motor vehicle accident, abuse, shaken baby, shaken adult, or it could be an acquired brain injury. And acquired brain injuries could be from a heart attack where the person lost oxygen to their brain for a period of time. It could be from a stroke or what's called AV malformation. It could be somebody who had surgery for a brain tumor and they got the tumor out, but on the way in, they had to hurt some brain cells in the process. People living with brain injuries oftentimes get an acquired brain injury from overdoses, and we're seeing this more and more as our country is dealing with the opioid epidemic. So folks who survive the overdose may have lost oxygen to their brain, and we'll talk about that quite a bit further on. The other thing that I really like to stress to folks is the interplay of trauma on brain injury, and people who have had the very similar traumatic brain injuries can present on paper as having the same issues, but one person will do better going forward and being able to use rehab than somebody else. And again, I've been in this field for a long time, and it took me a while to figure out in those circumstances, the person who on paper looked like they should have done just great actually had a history of trauma. And by trauma, I mean childhood neglect, childhood separation from an important figure in their life. Family was not as functional as it might have been to provide that child with a healthy early experience. So trauma in childhood has a long arm. Just as brain injury, no matter when it occurs, can have a long arm in terms of impacting somebody's life. And the other piece I just want to introduce is harm reduction. And that's a word that's kind of new to me, and it really is from our colleagues in the addiction field. And some models of addiction treatment are total abstinent right off the bat, and for some people, it does work quite well. Other people do better to be met where they are in that moment. I have a colleague who would say, so you're drinking 2 6-packs a night. Why don't we try doing 1 6-pack a night? And then the next week, 1 6-pack? How about half that 6-pack? So that's called harm reduction. So you give people incremental steps towards wellness, no matter what it is. And really, you can think about it in terms of anything we do that's maybe not so good for us. So maybe I'm a couch potato. So instead of being on the couch binge watching Netflix all weekend, I'm going to take a break between shows and I'm going to take a 5-minute walk. That's harm reduction. Maybe I'm used to having a little bit of a sweet. Have my box of Oreos, that's my after dinner treat. Sometimes it turns into more than one Oreo. So maybe I'm only going to have an Oreo Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and of course Saturday. And then I'm going to reduce the amount of Oreos I eat. Again, harm reduction, simple stuff we can all apply to most of us in our experiences. But for people living with addiction, it can be a really good way to at least get them into treatment so that they don't feel judged and can begin to work on small incremental goals. It's really related to being person-centered, and it's something that's really been found to be very helpful for people living with cognitive issues secondary to either a traumatic brain injury or an acquired brain injury. So we in the brain injury world have learned quite a bit from our addiction colleagues, and we really need to honor people's strengths. It's been my experience when writing treatment plans with people when they come into a rehab program, that I have 2 columns. I talk about the injury-imposed challenges, and I talk about the strengths they have that they bring in with them to help them deal with those challenges. And more than one person has looked at that when I've written it all down and had it all typed up. So look at this. I'm like, really? I'm like, well, sure. These are your strengths. You and I have talked. The teams work with you for 2 weeks, and they have been so overwhelmed in the aftermath of their injury and so focused on the things that are wrong with them that being reminded of their strengths post-injury and also what they had going on before injury can be very powerful and really help people engage in services when they know that their strengths are being honored by the folks who are providing services with and to them. So this is a pretty busy slide, and it's one that I put together, and I'm not going to go over piece by piece, but for people living with brain injuries, it's one thing to say, don't do drugs, not good for your brain. It's another thing to say, well, gosh, look what I found out looking at the evidence that we have, that the researchers are telling us. It's not just Stacia saying it's not a good idea to drink after your brain injury, but this is what we know. And we do know, because you're here with us in program, or you're here with me sitting down talking about it, that on some level you are really motivated to do well for yourself and to keep your brain healthy. So this is news you can use. This is some things that you can take a look at and make a good decision about what is best for you. So I just looked at some of the major substances that the people that I've worked with over the years tend to struggle with. Alcohol is probably the big one, and we do have the most research available to us to say, this is not good for your brain. It's not good for your brain cells. It's not good for your memory. It can increase your seizure risk. Oftentimes that gets people's attention, because a brain injury, even though you never had a seizure at the time of the injury or thereafter, and I've worked with folks who never had a seizure until 2 years post-injury, back to work, living on their own, start drinking, and then they have a grand mal seizure that really sets them back. So I just want to give you a heads up. I want you to have this information so you can make the best decision for yourself. It can exacerbate, alcohol can, mental health issues. Marijuana, we don't know a lot. We're just starting to learn more because of the measures going on around the country in terms of decriminalization and freeing up money for research. So we will soon know what are the benefits and what are the drawbacks of marijuana in general. But more specifically, I'm interested in how does this apply to people living with a brain injury? And we do know a few things. We do know that it can impair some folks' balance. We do know that it can impair memory and new learning, especially if you're a young person using it and your brain's not fully developed yet. So it impacts the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which I'm going to talk about later. And it's a small part of your brain, but it's an important part of your brain. It really helps you learn and consolidate. In other words, keep that information in your mind. You will have that available to you. And for people who use marijuana, there has been some research that suggests that it might hurt your hippocampus. We do not want you to hurt your hippocampus, especially if you've had a brain injury. And then heroin and other opioids. You can see from the chart, not a good thing for our brains. So again, this is just something that can prompt discussion. Maybe people want to take it and maybe they're not buying what I'm selling, but hey, let me go look on PubMed, which is the National Institutes of Health's online research portal. And if you are somebody who loves reading research and just quick abstracts that give you the cliff notes, you can give yourself a really good education. So I always encourage people to, if you're interested, that's one of the resources that have been vetted. It's not just the Wild West of the internet telling you it's good or bad to use marijuana. So we're going to talk about addiction, kind of the big picture, talk about brain injury and behavioral health. And when I talk about behavioral health, that's the umbrella term. And underneath behavioral health, we are talking about mental health and addiction or substance use related disorder. So in the state of Maryland, we have integrated our system. So people don't have to go 2 different places if they are living with more than one issue. So integrating health is the best way to go. And for people living with brain injury, that's even more beneficial, because if you've heard the 101 background about brain injury, sometimes organization's a real issue. So if I just have to go to one place for my services, that's probably more likely that I'm going to start going and keep going. I'm also going to talk about addiction and acquired and traumatic brain injury. What does recovery mean? What is helpful and not helpful in supporting people who are living with brain injury and dealing with a substance use related disorder, or otherwise known as addiction. And then tips to help folks in a person-centered way, which means meeting them where they are. So we're going to do a little truth and fiction, because it's amazing how hard myths die around addiction. And this holds true for anybody living with addiction, so this is not specific to brain injury. If one or both of your parents has a drinking problem, chances are you will too. We always used to think this, and it is not true. So, in fact, it is a higher risk. So 50% of children of alcoholics will deal with some issues, but half of them do not. So this is the good news. They are more likely than the general population. However, genes are not your destiny. And I think for children in families where addiction is in the history, and it's in my family's history, I've always been very upfront with talking to the kids about, just something to watch out for that's in the genes a few generations back, and we just need to be careful. We don't want that flip switched. But half folks who grow up in homes with an alcoholic parent do not develop an alcohol use disorder. That's the good news. For many people living with addiction, getting clean and staying clean might take more than just saying no. So if you remember the 80s, those of us who were around, that was a big public service message. So just to say no, and you'll be okay in terms of staying away from drugs or alcohol. So that's not something that's helpful. We've learned. And good intentions back in the 80s, but we know for a fact that you need to do more than just say no for most people. Lasting sobriety requires a multi-pronged approach for folks, and nobody is going to, the same approach doesn't work for everybody. You really have to tailor it. And again, that's part of that person-centered approach I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to continue to mention. They have to meet people where they are. So for some folks, going to a 12-step program is going to do it for them. They go to that first Alcoholic Anonymous meeting, or they go to the Narcotics Anonymous meeting, and it's like they found their home. And 90 meetings in 90 days is often suggested for folks, and they just take to it like a duck to water, and they get their sobriety. For others, it requires a little bit something else, or maybe in addition to the 12 steps. So medical assisted treatment is very, very useful for some people. So what does that mean? There are drugs that can help support people. There are drugs that are used for folks who are addicted to alcohol to help keep them sober. So I'm not going to name the drugs because I'm not a doctor, but there are some drugs that people can take. And when they do take a drink of alcohol, say they slip, it can make them feel really ill. So that's an adverse consequence, and that will help them refrain from alcohol. I want to say a little bit about alcohol and withdrawal from alcohol. Again, not a doctor, but if you are somebody withdrawing from heroin, you will hear people say, it's like, I feel like I'm dying. And it could feel like that. But you are probably not going to die from withdrawal from heroin or opioids. You're going to feel pretty crummy. But you can die from withdrawal from alcohol if you've been a heavy, long-term drinker. Seizures and catastrophic health issues if you don't do it under the supervision of a medical professional. So white knuckling it always is not the best course of action, especially, again, for folks who've been living with an alcohol use disorder for many, many years. Best to check with their doctor and have that medically supervised. Usually it's done in an inpatient setting. So for folks who are living with an opioid use disorder, there has been some evidence, and again, the epidemic is fairly new. In the past 10 years, we've seen it ramp up around the country, but the National Institute on Drug Abuse, our researchers there have found that medication-assisted treatment not only helps people stay sober from their drug of choice, be it over-the-counter prescription or heroin and other street drugs, that it helps cut down on their likelihood of getting an infectious disease such as HIV. It also helps in preventing overdoses. So more information can be found, of course, at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, but medical assisted treatment right now is considered a best practice for helping people deal with their addiction. So addiction, like diabetes, bipolar disorder, and heart disease, is a medical condition. True, 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 true. It may not feel like that to the family members and loved ones who are watching somebody deal with an addiction, who is living with an addiction, but it is a medical and biological condition. And I just found this quote from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. It's a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. What does that mean? So once somebody has become addicted, the brain is looped in. And we're particularly vulnerable to developing addiction when our brain is young. So you often hear, we really just need to help kids postpone that first drink, because if they are susceptible biologically, say it's in their family, to addiction, they have that first drink at 11, 12, 13. And if you read people in recovery stories, that's a common theme. I took that first drink, my parents had a party, I just drank all the leftover alcohol in the glasses. So that's really key. So it is a biological response to the substance, and it becomes ingrained, and then you have the addiction. If somebody is in recovery from drugs or alcohol, relapse is common. Yes, 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 it is true. It is considered part of the whole cycle. And people will more often than not relapse than folks who will be able to stay the course. It's frustrating for those who love them. It's frustrating and often shameful for the person who is really trying to stay in recovery. And I just want to say a word about person-centered language. You might have noted that I said the person wants to stay in recovery. I didn't use the word clean, because that connotates that a person who uses drugs or alcohol is somehow dirty. And we hear that term used, well, yeah, dirty urine. That's a really pejorative, judgmental thing to say. And we all use shorthand in the medical setting. We do, it's how we communicate with each other. But I think we need to be really careful about using language like that, because it can maybe change our feelings or the way that we interact with the people that we're supposed to be supporting and working with. So relapse is common, and people should be supported to do what they can to engage back in recovery in order to stay away from the substance of choice. So in Maryland, like the rest of the country, we are really dealing with an epidemic. And there's lots of reasons for it, and lots has been written about it. Long story short is we are losing people. And so anything that we can do in any setting to engage people, educate them, provide them with resources, people who are already addicted and people who are at higher risk of addiction. And guess what? That's why we're here today, because people living with brain injury are vulnerable to addiction. So in Maryland, we're doing a pretty good job of trying to address the epidemic. We haven't dealt with it in the way that we can say we're one in terms of preventing people from dying, but we're learning a lot. We're able to use some federal monies around the state to really treat and support people and ramp up our programs to do that. So one of the things that Maryland is doing is that we have overdose fatality review teams. And what that is folks located in the local health departments who bring together quarterly people who've touched the lives of folks who've overdosed in that county. And some quarters they don't have a lot of folks to review, and other quarters, unfortunately, they may have a lot more. But what they try to do is what is called a social autopsy. What brought the person to this point in time that they lost their life to the drug? And so in 2018, 415 individuals, their cases were reviewed by the Overdose Fatality Review Team in their county. And the team consists of public health professionals, so social workers, addiction folks. It could be a nurse, could be people from the medical emergency services system, could be somebody from family service, people who touch that individual's life. It could be a family member. So they bring together and they try to go back in time, and there's certain parameters that they look at, but to really try to create a picture of what happened here and how can we prevent the next one. And they found at least 13 people per their review had a history of brain injury. We suspect that that might be underreported, and we are doing some educating from the Maryland Public Behavioral Health System to pick up clues when they review cases that this person may have had a hidden history of brain injury, because brain injury is pretty sneaky, and it's not always obvious that somebody may have had that history before they had the overdose, the fatal overdose. So brain injury and the brain injury disability community is fairly new. So I started in this field, my first job was in 1983. And the Brain Injury Association of America's predecessor, the National Head Injury Foundation, was founded within a year or two of that. My employment start in the field of brain injury. So I grew up with the field, literally. People would die who incurred a moderate to severe brain injury back in the 70s and 80s. We did not have the great system of trauma care, the ability to treat people within that golden hour that was really pioneered in Maryland at our shock trauma system. So took lessons learned in Vietnam. So stabilized people in the field with that helicopter coming down and then getting them to the trauma center. So I guess if there's any silver lining to war, that might be one of them. And so people survived. And what do we do now? They survive, they emerge from a coma, now what? Because before, about half of those people would not have made it. They would have died of their injuries. So because we have this whole cohort of people surviving with brain injuries, and we have a traumatic brain injury model system around the country, so these are institutions that are doing research around brain injury. They are following over 7,000 people at this point who are living with a brain injury. And these are all folks who were identified as having a brain injury, people who were in brain injury rehabilitation programs, and they followed them long term, and they found that people living with brain injury, even those who got really good treatment, are 11 times more likely to die from an accidental poisoning from drugs or alcohol than a person who has not had a history of brain injury. So why is that? I mean, if you peel back the onion, you can think, so I know people with brain injuries have a memory issue sometimes. So maybe they forgot when they took their last dose of medicine. People with brain injuries are more common to have a history of alcohol use that was problematic, and so maybe post their brain injury over time, they've lost the message not to drink that their doctor gave them, and they start mixing. So as a result, and there's other issues people deal with, more chronic disabilities post-brain injury, but people living with brain injury in this group, which is large, lived 9 years less than people without a history of brain injury. So this is a chronic condition, and people need to be supported throughout their lives if they're living with a brain injury. people who misuse alcohol and other drugs are no more likely to have a traumatic brain injury than anyone else. Nope. When all factors are considered, and this is from Dr. John Corrigan and Dr. Miskew, who've published papers and books on this topic, it would appear reasonable to expect that half of the adults under 65 receiving inpatient rehabilitation for a primary diagnosis, so these are the ones that we know about again, of traumatic brain injury have prior histories of either alcohol misuse or illicit drug use. So we are now beginning to gather evidence that people living with brain injuries have this history, which probably made them more at risk for the brain injury. And I remember a colleague of mine who used to work at a major trauma center here said, oh, on a weekend, they all have alcohol on board when they come in for a traumatic brain injury. And research suggests, and this is those hidden folks that aren't counted by our model systems, they are in our jails, they are in our mental health facilities, they are in our homeless services, or they're not in any services and they're living under a bridge. About half of those individuals cannot engage in the challenges of daily life. They can't engage and oftentimes develop secondary issues like addiction. If they didn't have it before the injury, they're very much at risk of developing it after the injury. So if a person can't get oxygen to their brain for 4 to 6 minutes, they might suffer an acquired brain injury. I think I set you up for this earlier, but it's absolutely, absolutely true. It can result from all those instances I mentioned earlier. So drowning, cardiac event, opioid overdose, or overdoses. And people who survive an overdose or overdose from heroin, fentanyl, or prescription opioids are at risk of an acquired brain injury. So they survive and then they go forward with a disadvantage, and that is the brain injury. So some other things that can affect addiction, just to briefly go over. Depression and anxiety. People oftentimes will use alcohol or other drugs to treat a mental illness that has not been identified. Boredom. Some people will use out of boredom. A history of trauma. So again, if you are a person who's had a early life experience or experiences that wasn't positive, you were a child who was at risk, maybe the family wasn't so united, maybe you lived in an environment where there was a lot of danger, you may have a history of trauma, and of course other mental health disorders. And then your family history, and again, family is not destiny, but it is what you're familiar with, it is what feels right to you. So what may seem like, if you're somebody who hasn't had this history in your family, what seems like a bender to you might be just another Saturday night for your friend. Because in their family, that 6-pack of beer consumed by dad or mom or both was just the way it was. So what do you do about it? Just say no? Nope, can't do that, because change is hard. Even if you're so motivated, change is hard. And just think of your own life. How many of us have made a major change? We're so happy, we're so proud of ourselves, but I bet you that change was a long time coming. You thought about it, maybe somebody else had to tell you about it. How many of us have been nagged by a loved one or even your doctor that you need to fix, you need to change, you need to improve. And you were like, I'm good. Get your nose out of my business, doc, or wife, or husband, or partner. We don't like being told what to do. We kind of turn into the bad kid that just wants to be defiant. That's just human nature. We don't like to be ordered around by other people, which is why when I learned about the stages of change 30 years ago, it blew my mind, and it really, really helped me change the way I approached my work. Instead of being frustrated that somebody wasn't responding to my pearls of wisdom, falling out of my lips, I understood that I could talk at them all I wanted to about not using alcohol after their brain injury, about using strategies to support themselves for their memory problems. If they weren't ready to hear those messages, if they couldn't see it, then I could not really help impact their behavior. Only thing I could do was meet them where they were and understand that at the beginning, and think of yourself, maybe your blood pressure is a little high, but it's fine. My mother had it, lived to 95. I'm fine. You would be in what we call pre-contemplation. So pre-contemplation is unaware. You are unaware that a problem exists. No plans to change. Those around you may be saying, oh gosh, I really wish you'd go to a meeting. But you're like, no, I'm good. So no matter how much people nag you, bug you, drop leaflets on your bedside table, you are not buying what they're selling. And that is how many people come into services. Maybe the courts requested that they attend either brain injury services, because we have folks who come court ordered in our programs here in Maryland, or maybe they come into drug and alcohol program because the judge said you do that or you go to jail. So they are like this. They're not interested. Contemplation is when, wow, my wife keeps talking to me about this issue, and it's harder and harder for me to get up and go to work on Mondays. I'm just doing what I do on weekends, just having a good time. But gosh, it might be catching up to me. Or maybe you've had even more serious consequence and the police have pulled you over, once. And if it happens again, strong arm of the law is going to come down on you and you won't be able to drive your car to work for a while. You will have court costs to pay. So you start to think about these things. But guess what? It is November and I have Thanksgiving and the holidays and New Year's, so maybe maybe I'm moving to preparation now. Maybe I'll stop on New Year's Eve. Wait a minute, New Year's Day brunches are pretty much a lot of fun. So I'm in contemplation now. I'm thinking about it, and then I start to move into that preparation where I'm actually gelling a plan. And so maybe my plan is January 2nd. I'm going to stop drinking. Well, what am I going to do about that? Well, maybe I'll think about that 12-step meeting that I know meets in my church basement. Well, my neighbor is going to see me there, so maybe there's some other meetings around town I can go to. So you're kind of thinking about it, but it's not 100% firmed up, but then you take action. Then, it's coming up January 2nd, and I think I'm ready for this. And because, well, of course, my wife's saying she's going to leave me if I don't. So I got some motivation here. That's external motivation. But I love my wife. I like my life, and it becomes an internal motivation for me. So maybe I'm gonna make a change. And after you go through January 1st, you have poured the booze out. You're starting to dip your toe in the 12-step meetings. And gee, did you know that if you go to an open meeting, you can bring somebody with you? And for people living with brain injuries, that is the world. So folks living with brain injuries oftentimes are frightened to death of walking into a strange environment, thinking they have to talk. Hi, my name is Stacia and I'm an alcoholic. Oh, no. So if you are working with somebody living with a brain injury who says, you know what, I'm really ready. I'm ready to try this 12-step business. I don't like this God junk, but boy, I think I need to make a change. You can go with them. A family member can go with them to an open meeting. You don't have to be somebody living with a problem to go to an open meeting. So just a FYI, I've been to a few with individuals I've supported, and they found it really helpful to have somebody next to them that knew how to, support them, redirect them, prepare them before the meeting if they wanted to share. And then maintenance. Maintenance is just, I'm going to keep going to the meetings. I'm going to go to my doctor. I'm going to go see somebody for individual counseling. My wife is still angry with me. She's glad that I've stopped, but maybe we need to check out some couples counseling. So maintenance is fabulous. You can avoid the relapse, but you can relapse, as I mentioned earlier. So that doesn't mean failure. So for those in those early stages of change, that pre-contemplation and contemplation, especially if they're living with a brain injury, they may have no idea that they have an issue. It's just never occurred to them. So just as people who do not have a history of brain injury oftentimes are like Teflon when presented with the evidence that their use is a problem to those around them as well as themselves, just times that by 500 for people living with brain injury. If they have problems with their frontal lobe, their executive thinking, their ability to understand consequences, that can really impact a person's ability to engage with either a 12-step program or any steps towards recovery to an alcohol or drug-free life. So the recommended treatment approach is non-confrontational. It's education regarding the impact of risk-taking behavior, be it trying to drive without a license. So for example, a lot of folks after a brain injury have visual issues. They're not seeing part of their visual field. So you're not going to give them their license knowing that they can't see traffic coming at them from the left side. It's the same thing. You educate. This is where your eye is having trouble seeing. This is how you can compensate for it. This is how you learn to work around it so you can pass that driver's test. So it's kind of the same thing with substances. You just have to give them the information in a non-judgmental way. And you really do have a window of opportunity, those of us in the world of brain injury, because people typically, in my experience, come into rehab for brain injuries if they've had alcohol or drugs involved with the circumstances of their injury. Born again. I've seen the light, never going to use again. I'm good. Thanks a lot. And historically, those of us in the more medical model of a rehab program will say, well, good, because I just have to report to the insurance company that I'm working on his memory, that I'm working on his arms, that I'm working on his walking. I don't have time for this. And by the way, we don't have an addiction specialist on staff, so we're all good to go. He says he's not going to use. And God knows I never had any training in addiction when I was in speech or occupational therapy or physical therapy training. Never heard of it. So they want to stay in their lane, but we do folks a disservice because the research tells us that on average, a person who had an issue with substances before their injury has a honeymoon period. It's 2 years, typically. So 2 years, they stick to that dedication to sobriety, and it's kind of easy, right? Because they have family and friends around that are keeping an eye on them. And then after 2 years, they go back to their former level of use. And so we have this window of opportunity where we meet people where they are, and where they are saying, I don't want to use again. So instead of saying, that's great, check, we give them information, we give them resources. The most useful thing you can do. So one thing that I've had a lot of folks say to me when I educate and suggest and give resources is, I hate that higher powered stuff, Stacia. I don't believe in a higher power. That really turns me off. And so some smart person, his name was William Peterson, back in the 80s. I didn't see this until the early aughts because we did not have the internet back in the 1980s. He took the 12 steps and he put that into language that the folks living with brain injury will understand. And now we also have this wonderful messages to share. So for folks who are living with brain injury, this is so specific. We have what you need to know. News you can use to keep your brain healthy after a brain injury. Like that big chart I showed you early on, it really covers a lot of the same ground. One thing that I oftentimes highlight, and that is after a brain injury, alcohol and other drugs have a more powerful effect. So if you were able to drink a glass of wine, maybe 2, and still be able to carry on a conversation. After the brain injury, your brain may be a little bit more vulnerable. You have that one drink and hits you real hard, and all of a sudden your coordination is way off, and oops, you might be vulnerable to another fall, another brain injury. And so people need to know this. We're adults, but I need to do my due diligence as a brain injury professional and give you this information. Alcohol lowers the seizure threshold, as I mentioned earlier. That is so important for people to be aware of. Again, even if you never had a seizure post your injury, you are still at risk if you drink, because alcohol lowers the seizure threshold and a brain injury history lowers the seizure threshold. So these are all great tips that you can share with folks. I grabbed these from the headlines, and for people who are unaware of the impact of an opioid overdose on the brain, this was really probably the first they heard or knew of it. And they say that journalists write the first draft of history. Well, here we go from 2016, 2017, 2018, when the epidemic became obvious to those in the policy realm, in government, and in the healthcare realm. They talked about opioids, are they behind amnesia, which is kind of an old school term for bad memory. Heroin's hijacking the brain. So these were on, NPR and other major news outlets. So we started to understand that this was a big issue. And early on, Dr. Mark Hott, and he's in West Virginia, I love this quote because this is what we've known for years about people living with traumatic brain injury. So people who emerge, thankfully surviving an opioid overdose, he says they all have difficulty learning new information. Every day is pretty much a new day for them. And sometimes within a day, they can't maintain the information they learned the day before. This is so familiar to those of us working in the field of brain injury services. And the conclusion from that is if they have those memory issues, how are they going to be able to engage with and benefit from services? And how are they going to evolve to have a new life that doesn't involve that old life that was really quite overtaken with seeking and using drugs? And I really liked what this professor from Boston University says about likening the overdose to a concussion. You don't die. Concussions aren't going to kill us. And most people do recover from concussion. 90% of people who have a concussion do just fine. They're back to themselves, no longer than 2 weeks, if that. But there is a group of folks who have severe sequelae following a concussion, and it's made worse if they have multiple concussions. Folks who are athletes, folks who are victims of domestic violence, each hit to the head magnifies the last hit. And by the time it's all added up, their functional, their cognitive and thinking skills, maybe some physical areas of functioning are just as impaired as somebody who had a very obvious severe or moderate traumatic brain injury. So it's cumulative damage, and they're seeing that opioids overdose can have a similar scenario. So I had talked about that hippocampus, one of my favorite brain parts, and it's a high oxygen user, and as is the frontal lobe region, which is the seat of our adult thinking. And so when you have a cutoff of your oxygen, those are the parts of the brain that take the hit, the high oxygen users. The oxygen hogs, as Dr. John Corrigan of Ohio Valley likes to refer to them. And they're responsible for being able to manage the world as adults. And when that takes a hit, you can just imagine how difficult it is for folks who have recovered from an overdose to then follow the recommendations. They may be perfectly motivated to go into treatment, but if they're sitting in the traditional way that a substance use related disorder treatment's delivered, they're sitting in a big room with lots of other people talking all at once. They don't have a board up that helps them anchor to the content, and they get lost. And I've talked to addiction specialists about this, and they'll say, yeah, wow, I never thought of that. Because there's one individual, he sees me individually, and he's so motivated, and he gets into group, and he just has a meltdown and storms out throwing chairs, and nobody likes him. Nobody wants him in group. They all talk behind his back. So there he is, cutting off his potential support system. And it's because he's living with an acquired brain injury secondary to more than one overdose survival. So easy to misinterpret that as somebody who's non-compliant, non-resistive, or resistive to treatment, refusing to engage. And if that continues, if they're court-ordered, they may be back in front of the judge in a detention center. So again, multiple blows to the head will do the same thing to those critical adult thinking areas. So our overdose fatality review teams really doing great detective work, and hopefully as things move on and we work with them within the public behavioral health arena, they'll begin to be more tuned into the clues when they review cases that person might have had a history of brain injury. And our hope is that they will, in working with people before that overdose, be able to flag that they may be living with an opioid-related brain injury or have a traumatic brain injury on board that is there even before the opioid use starts. So this is a summary. This is not one person. This is a typical scenario of somebody who was reviewed by the overdose fatality review team in Baltimore County. So typical young man, Caucasian. He died on January 15th, 2018, and the toxology screen found heroin and fentanyl in the system. His girlfriend did her due diligence and she reported the death. Unfortunately, she was using at the same time and didn't realize he had overdosed, to the next morning. No trauma. So there's no trauma, no foul play, no reason to think this wasn't anything other than opioid overdose. And the Baltimore City Police, who have been familiar with this person because he lived in Baltimore City, the subject had a long history of using opioids, heroin, and also he used cocaine. So they didn't worry that this was a malicious act that resulted in his death. So when they looked in Maryland, we have a prescription drug monitoring program. It's intended to prevent people from shopping doctors to get prescriptions. So when a doctor has to prescribe an opioid, they can go into the system and say, oh, my colleague down the hall gave him a script for 30 pills 2 days ago. I'm not going to do that. It's a way of trying to prevent the initiation into addiction and also abuse moving forward. So he had been in the emergency department at a hospital many times over the summer and fall of 2016, moving into 2017. And boy, our hospital records, our CRISP system, found a history of a motor vehicle accident in 2016 that left him with some pain. Me, the brain injury person, looks at that and says, I wonder if he also had his head shook up in that accident. Maybe he never lost consciousness, but if you are in a motor vehicle accident and you have enough force applied, your brain can shake around in its skull. And I'm going to make my little brain puppet for you now. So here's my nice soft brain, and here's my skull that has some sharp, bony sections to it. And that force, say I'm rear-ended, my brain moves around and it scrapes up against those bones right here, right where my important frontal lobe that I need for my adult thinking and problem solving. And so I'm wondering, again, looking at this through a brain injury informed lens, if that young man who did not have any record of opioid prescription prior to that car accident, just wondering if there's some connection there. And then we look back at some of his interaction with the law of the not so positive variety. And you can see in 2017, note that's after the car accident. Assault charges, domestic, so maybe intimate partner violence. Theft and possession, most likely related to drug seeking. And two previous non-fatal overdoses in 2017. So perhaps he had some loss of oxygen to his brain in those earlier overdoses that he survived, but incrementally hits are being taken to those critical thinking centers of his brain. Oh boy, now we're looking at what social services has to share with us. As a child, he was a subject of a neglect investigation. So maybe his brain wasn't so enriched growing up. His parents had struggles with substance use, and there was domestic violence reported in the home. So he might have had himself been exposed to violence, both psychologically and also physically. And we know if you have a brain injury in your younger years, it really impedes the trajectory of developing into a mature thinking adult. He was seen by the health department, so I read that as he knew he needed something. Something wasn't going right in his life. He sought help at the health department. You walk into our health departments here in Maryland, there's wonderful brochures available. Here's how you can get help. Somebody's always there behind the window. So he sounds to me that he made the effort. But he didn't follow through. Well, I guess he wants to use drugs more than he wants to get better. This is how it can be misinterpreted. I read it that he didn't follow up because they said, okay, John, we'll see you next week, 11 o'clock. And John's like, great, thank you. Walks out the door. Wait a minute. What day next week? Maybe he's already home. Oh, darn. Wait, where's the number? Hey, my friend wants to go party. So, oh well. And so you can see how people can fall right back into old habits, not follow through with, really sincere desire to change, but not supported. And very easily, maybe if someone had given him a piece of paper, maybe if somebody had said to him, John, do you got a calendar in your phone? Let's put that in there. Do you have a number that we could call? Maybe if somebody had kind of closed that loop for him, he would have been more likely to show up. But that says to me that he was in a contemplation stage, that he might have been ready to do something about his use. Detention center, short stays only. So he got in trouble, assaulted his girlfriend, stole something, person dropped the charges. So he didn't stay too long. Maybe if he had, he would have entered into the recovery programs that Maryland detention centers offer. But he didn't do anything severe enough in order to get that kind of treatment. So out he goes and back to business. He did try treatment. Look at that. Good for you, John. But discharged for noncompliance and conflict with other patients. So maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Maybe he was a real pain in the neck. But that doesn't mean that a brain injury or brain injuries, now looking at this young man's history, might not have also been in play. So maybe he's not understanding what's going on in the group. Maybe it's hard for him to process. Maybe he misreads somebody's joke as an insult because he's got that frontal lobe injury that does not allow him to be an abstract thinker to the point we think adults should have, the ability to look beyond the concrete. Maybe his fatigue got to him, his cognitive fatigue while sitting in those long, endless groups. People are sharing and all starts to sound alike and he can't make sense of it and what's this got to do with me? And either he's sleeping or he's storming out. And it looks like from the notes the overdose fatality review team gathered that it was the latter. He couldn't tolerate how treatment was delivered to him. I had referenced that we have this wonderful adaptation of the 12 steps. And I did not put all 12 in, but you can see that somebody took the 12 steps and kind of put it through the brain injury informed blender and modified them in a very concrete way so that somebody living with a brain injury will say, well, I kind of took that God stuff out. It says, admit that if you drink or use other drugs, your life will be out of control. Admit that use of substances after having a traumatic brain injury will make your life unmanageable. Yeah, okay, I can buy that. And so it goes, and it's just a really nice reframing of the 12 steps for people who may have some issues with cognitively accessing that information. It's kind of written in a very old school language. It's from the 30s. And I just have to say, for those of you working day in and day out with people, you develop relationships. They develop a fondness for you. You develop a fondness for them. Their struggles are sometimes your struggles. We keep our boundaries, but we're their cheerleaders, and we really care. And know that even when they're, telling you to get out of the room or to go whatever, insert any bad word of your choice, that down deep, if you have that relationship, that they value your opinions and advice, and you don't have to be an addictions counselor. I don't need a certification on my wall to talk to people that I've worked with over the years about how drugs and alcohol will affect their recovery from a traumatic brain injury, because I do know about brain injury, and I know that's not going to be good for you and your goals, because you've told me you want to go back to work. So I'm misinforming you, giving you that education. It's not a good idea to use. So you can say, as your nursing assistant or your nurse, your therapist, your physical therapist, I just want to let you know that drinking and or drug use will impact your balance. And boy, you know, most falls in this country are the leading cause of brain injury. I don't want you in that category. We really want you to be safe. So all we can do to minimize your risk of fall, like using that cane, not using drugs or alcohol, is going to be one more thing you can do to really support your recovery from your brain injury. And I'll say it again, meeting people where they are is really the only way to go. So some folks up at Mount Sinai, one of our model systems, I mentioned them earlier, they do a lot of focus groups. They talk to people living with brain injury. They're not just living in their research ivory tower. They bring together focus groups. And so one of the focus groups they brought together were people living with a brain injury who also had a history of addiction. And they said, hey, you're sober. How did you do it? Tell us tell us your secrets. They said, well, we needed to find the right 12-step program. I needed to change persons, places, and things that trigger use. For some people, the higher power is useful. And then they mentioned pets. So let me just break it down a little bit. I'm going to go to the second point, find the right 12-step meeting. A young man I was working with in New York, 3 traumatic brain injuries. His skull had more titanium than bone. And he was still in his early 20s. And he was somebody who had a problem with alcohol, but he was getting ready to go to work. And we were like, we're really worried about this. And wanted him to go to a meeting. A lot of meetings are at night. He lives in Manhattan. He also walked with a cane and had a severe weakness on one side. We were afraid he would be like a big mugging target. He looked so vulnerable, and he had visual issues, so his head was always swaying around side to side. He might as well have had a sign on his back that said "mug me." And we actually did mugging exercises with him. John, give me your wallet. How fast he could pull it out. We wanted him to be safe. So he and I, when he finally made the commitment to going to a 12-step meeting, we said, let's find one during the day. Okay, Stacia, that sounds good. So we go down to the Wall Street area, and we go to a meeting, and we walk in. It was an open meeting, so I could be with him, and there was a bunch of 3-piece suited Wall Street kings of the universe talking about getting blasted on the commuter train back to Westchester. I'm like, ooh, and he looks at me, he's like, these aren't my people, Stacia. I'm like, you got that right. They're not my people either. And so, we slowly backed out of the room after a point. And he did some homework, and he found a meeting across the street from his apartment. And he found a sponsor for his meeting. And he disclosed to that person that he was somebody living with brain injury. And he gave permission for that person to talk to us. And we gave that person the strategies that would help him. If he wants to share his story, let's sit down. You sit down with him, we'll sit down with him and write an outline so he doesn't divulge from the path. And because he had a problem organizing his words and could talk for hours and not come to the point. So that was a way that he was able to be supported, and he did so well. He got a job with New York City Department of Education. He works with kids who have disabilities as a music therapy aid. So that's pretty powerful. So I do want to talk about pets. Well, why pets? We know about service dogs. You don't have to have a service dog or a service cat, guinea pig, or hamster. Having some other creature to take care of can help anchor people. So people living with brain injuries, sometimes they have a hard time getting out of bed if they're living also with depression. You cannot take your dog for a walk with a painful hangover. So having an animal, somebody else to take care of. Maybe you have burned all your bridges between the brain injury and the addiction. Your family's done with you. But if you can have a dog, cat, guinea pig, snake in your apartment or house, that will help anchor you. It really structures your day. I already mentioned the mandatory detox, so that is when people have their injury, they don't have access to drugs or alcohol. Maybe they're in a coma, so they certainly aren't going to be using. So we need to meet people at that point in time when they're ready, perhaps, and talk about what they can do to not fall into use after they get back on their feet from the brain injury. And again, we are often worried about folks who do not receive that traditional trajectory of inpatient, outpatient, brain injury specific services. So we are doing a lot of training in the state with folks who work in behavioral health so that they can help educate people they serve with mental health or addiction who may also have a brain injury in their history. And so they made that mentioned in this focus group. You know, and the other thing that they talked about was forging the new social bonds. So brain injury, sometimes the effects of it can really disrupt relationships. So how do we help people connect with others post a brain injury? And so finding that right 12-step program oftentimes is critical, but it's a challenge. So what do we recommend in general? You need to screen everybody just because it's not in their medical record. There are a lot of people walking around with a hidden brain injury. You know, when I train, I look at my audience and I said, how many of you have a family member and you just shake your head, you scratch your head, why can't the marriages work? Why can't the job be kept? Why? Peel back the onion. I've actually had people come up to me afterwards and go, oh my gosh, that explains it. He fell off a roof. So, you know, I don't want everybody to think that, you know, brain injury is the only reason why people have challenges, but it could be there. It's good to know, because if it is there, then you can support them and not automatically assume it's a personality issue. And the unenlightened brain injury professionals that I have had the pleasure of working with over time sometimes will say to me, oh, they have to hit rock bottom. Oh, they're going to lie to me if I ask them about their use. No and no. If you ask, people will tell. They will tell. So screen. And I have alluded already to adverse childhood experience. And at this time, finally, you know, because adverse childhood experience is the ACE, which is a 10-question survey, which looks at childhood experiences that were negative. And it was done through Kaiser Health years ago, and found that you know, people who said, yes, I was abused as a child, a parent went away to prison while I was a child, I did not get the food and the care that I needed as a child. If those things are a yes on 4 to 5 out of the 10, those now adults are more likely to have chronic physical issues and mental health issues, obesity, cardiac issues, and diabetes, as well as behavioral health, mental health, and addiction. So trying to link that. Now we don't know cause and effect, but there is a correlation. And it's something we need to be sensitive of, and because we know oftentimes people who have these hidden brain injuries had them in childhood. They might have been connected possibly to an adverse childhood experience or an environment that wasn't safe. If you're poor, you may not be able to afford the child safety measures that we, you know, automatically do if we have the means. You know, we're not securing the steps. We don't put the helmet on the child when they learn how to ride a bike, because we can't afford it. So when they started looking at this, they found that people living with brain injuries, there's a correlation. So the folks at Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are finding that exposure to adverse childhood experiences is associated with an increased risk of traumatic brain injury moving forward. That includes childhood abuse, psychological abuse, so physical and psychological, household member incarceration, so just a stressed out family, dad or mom is incarcerated, maybe there's not so many eyes on the child as they're growing up, and drug abuse. So we need to ask. We need to ask folks. This is the screening tool. You know, I do 3-hour, 4-hour, 8-hour trainings on how to incorporate this, but we do recommend people use the traumatic brain injury identification method out of the Ohio Valley Brain Injury Model Systems Program. And you should ask people that you're working with about their alcohol use. And because of brain injury, we want to make sure we're using accessible tools. And so the CAGE is good. The Brief Michigan Alcoholism Screening Test is good. The audit, and that comes from the World Health Organization. So the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, or the audit, also comes in Spanish, Danish, Norwegian, it comes German. So if you have a diverse population, that is a good one to use. You need to ask about use of opioids and marijuana. and then assess for that childhood trauma and maybe pull out the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey, that you can go online and get it very easily. So this is another resource, Accommodating the Symptoms of Traumatic Brain Injury, just a real quick guide that you can look at online that helps you support people living with brain injuries. And there's a number of other resources for you if you're interested in finding out more about what I touched upon. And we suggest, maybe you host a meeting in your facility that's accessible to folks with cognitive issues. There are open meetings that, as I said, that can be attended by not only the person who wishes to enter recovery, but their supporters. There is, if you're anywhere near the Towson area, Sheppard Pratt Conference Center does host an alcohol education meeting. It's 8 weeks. The content is the same, 8 modules. Dick Prody runs through it, and then he starts from the beginning again. You don't have to start at the beginning and go to the end, drop in whenever. If you can't get there, now it's online, all 8 lectures. I've been to them, they're excellent. Here's some other resources, Ohio Valley, Brainline, really good stuff for people living with brain injuries and or addiction, their families, and the professionals who are hoping to support them in the best way possible. And these are just resources around addiction that State of Maryland has available in collaboration with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. That's our federal agency that addresses addiction and mental health issues. Fabulous resources on their site. We have a crisis hotline here in Maryland, medication-assisted treatment. We're really one of the forerunners or front runners in using this model. And then the Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition is a group that educates and supports people in recovery. And that's just a little bit more information for you, including my contact information. So thank you.